journalism that you see around in one language, do you see the reach of that journalism going to other languages as well? As in, do you get the same quality of journalism across languages? Can we have a show of hands for those who find the same quality? Well, if you looked around, that itself is an indictment. There's just one hand that says it's the same quality. And as we're settling, it's one of the reasons why we need collaboration. So it reaches everybody in India. 22 languages, it has to reach every corner of India. And the only way of doing it sometimes is collaboration. And that's the topic of the panel, collaboration among media houses. Can Indian media follow suit? My name is HR Venkatesh. I work with Boom Live. I was a journalism fellow at Stanford, but also been in television and digital for many years. And we have a fantastic panel, and you'll know why. At the far corner is someone who deserves a round of applause, Ritu Kapoor from the Quint. And the reason is this is her fourth panel of the day. And Ritu, if you want to keep your questions, your answers to a minimum, we'd understand. Ritu Kapoor is the CEO and founder of the Quint, and once a boss as well. Next we have Rasmus Nielsen. He is from Oxford University. He's a professor there. He runs the Reuters Institute there, and he's also a contrarian, according to his Twitter biography. It's great to have Rasmus here. We have Nick Davies next. He's a former special correspondent of The Guardian, and he's been involved in many investigations. And it's collaboration, funnily enough, that has been seen among investigations worldwide, and we'll get into that in a moment. And we have Sachin Kalbag, who's the executive editor of Hindustan Times in Mumbai, and he's also fond of cricket, tennis, and sumo wrestling, I believe. So ask him questions about sumo wrestling. I'm certainly very curious. What is collaboration? I looked at basic definition of collaboration, and it says it's working with someone to produce or create something. And then there is a second line, and the second line says traitorous cooperation with an enemy. And that's the thing with journalists, you know, we're so busy competing with each other. It's very, very difficult to get us to collaborate, but I think the need of the hour is to collaborate. And Rasmus, I'm going to ask you to sort of give us a framework through which we can think about collaboration.
Sure. I mean, I'm really glad that you highlight the second part of that lexical definition, because I think it's very easy to see the word collaboration in this sort of warm and fuzzy light. You know, who doesn't want to work with others to create something? I suppose as a definition we might want to add to it voluntarily, right? Because lots of us work together with colleagues because we have to. We might like it, but we also have to. But I think it is really important to recognize up front that there are many situations where we don't want journalists to collaborate. I think you can all think of examples here from India, but right now, for example, as someone who cares about American politics, it's an absolute delight as a citizen to see the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times really go to town and see who can get the best sources on what Donald Trump may or may not have said to people in the Ukraine about what they should or should not do with Joe Biden. I mean, we want journalists to compete vigorously on stories like that, to dig up the sources, the information, and tell the best obtainable version of the truth. That said, I think there is also a case to be made for collaboration, even in this incredibly competitive profession and an almost pathologically competitive industry. And I think for me, the moment that really brought that home to me was in 2010, where some of you will remember a group of Chilean miners were stuck in a caving accident in Chile down in the mine. There were 30 some of them. And what happened next, I think, was very interesting, which was that the entire global media sent people literally to film a hole in the ground, right? And I remember speaking to people at the BBC who said that they had worked very hard internally to ensure they sent fewer people than there were people stuck down the mine. And the BBC actually ended up sending more than 35 people to Chile to film a hole in the ground. Now, this is competitive waste. There were more than 2,000 journalists on this mountain in Chile just doing the same thing. That's complete waste. There's no way in which this helps inform the public. There's no way in which this advances a story. There's no way in which this contributes. So I think we can see a lot of opportunities to maintain the vigorous competition on key stories, but also to see ways in which journalists can work together to cover the story, to advance the story on their own. We see this with very high-profile collaborations, the Panama Papers, Wikileaks, and many others, which I know Nick will speak about too, but also locally in many countries, and I think people here can draw inspiration from that. I want to hear maybe particularly Ritu's view on this, and yours too perhaps, about whether we can also think about collaboration beyond this, commercially for example. So are there ways in which news organizations can think about collaboration around things like advertising sales as they compete against the very large US-based platform companies? Are there ways in which we can think about how news organizations can collaborate around data gathering and registration systems? Again, these are things that are very expensive for small organizations to do on their own, but maybe they can be doing jointly. Are there ways in which they can think about collaboration around payment, for example, to have joint login systems and joint payment systems so that we can advance an industry that has some issues that we've heard from the editors in the panel before that are about politics, but also other issues, as Ritu have talked about earlier at the event, that are about commerce, if you will, how we make the technology, the distribution, the advertising, the data gathering, and the payment systems work in a way that can sustain the kind of journalism that everyone in this room believe in.
Right. Thanks for setting that up in terms of a framework. Sachin, the Times of India, for example, and Hindustan Times collaborating on a piece of journalism. For many journalists like us, that is something that has never happened. But I won't be surprised if in the past it has happened. But in your view, is that the kind of collaboration we need, or is it a different kind of collaboration, let's say among smaller newspapers, magazines, websites?
It's kind of unbelievable, but the Hindustan Times and the Times of India group did actually collaborate in the early 2000s to bring out a newspaper in Delhi. Which didn't really succeed well because there were differences on both sides, but that's history now. But there is an advertising collaboration between various newspaper houses in India. And this is, essentially to compete with the Times of India group, which is the largest newspaper group in the country. So there are these collaborations already present in our media world. The editorial collaborations is something that editors and publishers both have had an aversion to. One, because they won't be able to control the narrative that they want to put forth. By narrative, I don't mean that it's biased or ideologically biased or politically biased. What I mean is that they think, or the fear is that they don't have control over the story completely, because there are 2 or 3 organizations which may or may not be competing in the otherwise sense, are coming together and creating a story or developing a story. In the case of the Panama Papers, for instance, there was an international collaboration. So the newspapers were chosen for a particular reason, and the newspapers thought that international collaboration will work for a story as big as this. There have been smaller collaborations, but relatively unknown because these are not long-term collaborations. These may be one-off story collaborations. But these, again, like we spoke before the session began, is looking at only the larger newspapers and the larger TV channels' point of view. There are more than 17,000 newspapers registered in this country, more than 85,000 magazines that are registered in this country. There are more than 117,000 print publications in this country. So the potential for collaboration is infinite in that sense. However, what we also need to look at is, apart from the collaborations that we're looking at the bigger newspapers in bigger cities like Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, etc., there are literally hundreds of smaller newspapers who cater to the regional language market, who do not have the financial strength to go and do a large-scale investigation. They do not even have, in some cases, they do not even have the financial strength to pay salaries every month. So that is something that we need to look at, not just from a larger newspaper and a TV channel point of view, but also the smaller newspapers and magazines point of view. Because if you look at the smaller newspapers in regional languages, you'll find that they always depend on agency copy to mostly depend on agency copy to PTI or ANI or INS to look at to cover certain stories. So, like I said, they don't have control over the story that they want to highlight. If they do want to do that, then I think a collaboration would be essential to get things done. Even for a larger newspaper like the Hindustan Times, if we do not have reporters in the hinterland, rather than rely on freelancers whose ideological bias we may or we may not control, we look at credible names in those areas, smaller newspapers, but with credible names to collaborate with them on certain stories. they bring in domain expertise, they bring in geographical expertise, they also bring in language expertise, which I may not have sitting in Mumbai or Delhi. So that is one way of looking at editorial collaborations.
In other words, Airbnb of journalism. Ritu, you've spoken about the need for collaboration, especially among digital publishers, and you were part of a collaboration we set up, the Ekta News Coalition. Do you see, whether in terms of commercial collaboration or editorial or any other kind of collaboration, there is appetite and it'll actually work in India?
In a utopian world, there is so much reason to collaborate. And there is so much that different newsrooms can be complementing each other. In another time, in another era, when I was Network 18 or when I was CNN IBN, we used to collaborate with Hindustan Times on our Real Heroes campaign, for instance, because we didn't have a print outlet, they didn't have broadcast, and it was something that would work very, very well. But I think times have changed from the time that happened, because news media is so polarized now. I think there are issues of trust. I think there are issues of who takes primary ownership of breaking a story. I think things have changed. I think the environment has changed. So the question is, in this environment, how do you look for collaborations? I actually feel that let's look in spaces which are apolitical, like tech. For instance, right now there are so many of us all trying to crack the tech on either the paywall or trying to crack the tech on a membership model. And this is all complicated technology for newsrooms to build, because newsrooms traditionally haven't dealt with what has been the strength of e-commerce, which is transactional tech, etc. So why is it that everyone is currently reinventing the wheel? We're all trying to build out our tech individually. Tech is very expensive. We are all agreed through the conversations, through the day, that revenue is a challenge currently. So let's try. I think in the current universe, I think we have to find collaborations, not so much maybe on in editorial spaces, because I think different newsrooms have different editorial guardrails that they need to worry about. And I think then, that becomes a problem. Having said that, we have collaborated with the BBC on a campaign for, creating education and awareness on fake news, which we call Swachh Digital India. And that worked very well, because the BBC's audience and the Quint's audience was very different. And we sort of force multiplied in that sense. Our strength with doing sort of young, quirky, innovative videos versus BBC's, the Quint was very young at that point, BBC's deep credibility with its audiences. I think a collaboration like this, where there's no two ways, there is no political angle to that campaign. I think that is possible. I also think that I think we should really be looking at collaborations on ad tech. Also looking at maybe sharing campaigns where you can go out and approach, a sales team that can collaborate, and, because if it's print and if it's broadcast or if it's digital, there are possibilities of, everyone getting a bit of the wins.
Well, one thing we've seen is that when there is a model for collaboration, people know how to do it, they end up following suit. Has everyone heard of Wikileaks? Yes? Okay. Everyone heard of Edward Snowden and his revelations? Everyone's heard of Panama Papers? These are all interesting collaborations internationally, but they all have different DNA within the structure. And Nick was part of the Wikileaks revelations and collaboration. Could you tell us, and I understand it was unstructured, in that there was no organization binding you all together.
Okay. So back in the summer of 2010, I was working for The Guardian, the English newspaper, and I approached Julian Assange from WikiLeaks to talk to him about this huge amount of material, secret material, he had been given by the US whistleblower, the soldier, Chelsea Manning. Now, normally, I would say, I want this huge story for The Guardian. But from the word go, my approach was different, and so was Julian Assange's, because this story, like all the most important stories, was challenging power. We were challenging the power of the most powerful country in the history of the planet, the United States. And this presents two different kinds of problems. The first one is political. If one single newspaper takes on this powerful monster, it is all too possible that we'll lose, we'll be crushed. So from the outset, if we set up an alliance with other news organizations in other countries, we are more likely to have the political power to take them on and to win. And you understand our political power comes first of all from the sheer number of readers, millions and millions of readers for The Guardian and the New York Times and the German magazine Der Spiegel. But also, news organizations naturally have an alliance of powerful individuals, the politicians, the academics, the trade union leaders who read and support that newspaper. So by forming an international collaboration, we gave ourselves political power to fight the struggle to defend the story. But secondly, there's also the law. So in the UK, as here, media law is very hostile to news organizations. The Official Secrets Act, the defamation laws, and others make it difficult. Part of our collaboration was specifically with the New York Times. Now, the truth about the United States is that it is in many ways a repressive society. It is not nearly as free as it likes to pretend. But from the point of view of journalists, the First Amendment to the Constitution is incredibly important because it makes it almost impossible for the government to shut down a story before it's published. Almost impossible. In the UK, it's really easy. So by linking up with the New York Times, it meant that if the British government went to court in London and said, we want the judge to order The Guardian not to publish, we could say, that's ridiculous. The New York Times are going to publish tomorrow. The story isn't secret, so we must be allowed to publish. So in our case with the Wikileaks, it was for the political and legal power that it gave us that we created that collaboration.
So WikiLeaks, that's an interesting point. I don't know how easy it would be in India, but WikiLeaks was really the first of a series of collaborations, or maybe there were ones before, but the ones we know internationally was that one. Rasmus, we had ICIJ, for example. It got the story from a German newspaper, and they roped in 107 media organizations across 80 countries to publish the Panama Papers. Interestingly, I understand the New York Times was not part of that because they felt they didn't want to be part of it, but the next one, the Paradise Papers, they were a part of it. Do you see this kind of appetite in countries like India, which technically are as diverse as, let's say, the European Union, where what Nick described could potentially happen? Do you see something like that as an observer happening in India?
So I think the example of Wikileaks is really important, and it's a pioneering one, and I think everyone looks towards this as an aspiration for the work that you did and the way in which you approached it. But it's also, I think, useful to add perhaps a third reason to the ones you identified as to why you collaborated, which you had a unique source. And this is something that drew the collaborators together, because the two other arguments simply about power and about legal issues, if those two reasons were the only reasons, Spiegel and the New York Times and the Guardian would have been collaborating on lots of stories, and you didn't. You collaborated specifically on WikiLeaks. So there was a source, there was some unique material that all the collaborators could only access by working together with the Guardian and with Julian Assange. And I think this is the case again with many of the later collaborations too, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers and the like. I think what we have seen as people have built on the lessons that you and others drew from the case of WikiLeaks is the attempt to create structures that facilitate the collaboration. Right? So the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists it helps maintain a network where people get to trust each other, they have a track record, they've worked together before, They know that they can rely on each other. They create an infrastructure through which information and data and documents can be shared, where people can have confidence that this won't be compromised by an individual being careless with their information security. And I suppose if we were to think about the potential for this in India, I suppose in addition just to seeing the incredible power of the collaborations like Wikileaks and those that came later, is to also think about what are the steps, the more prosaic, practical steps that were taken to ensure that these things can happen again. So the formation of some form of collaborative enterprise that would help people get to know each other, that would help identify who is good faith collaborators, who are not, who are the ones you can actually depend on, the creation of an infrastructure through which information could be gathered, and perhaps also a way of signaling to potential whistleblowers, because again, this is a common thread of many of these collaborations, is that whistleblowers provided documentation that allowed the collaboration to happen, that potential whistleblowers would feel that they could go to this network and be confident that if they gave documents to this network on a story of public importance, it would be treated in a way that was in the public interest. It would be done responsibly, and it would be published by the Quint, if the Quint was part of it, but not only by the Quint, also by HT and also by other publications that took part in it.
Well, there are a couple of other issues we could take up, but I want to be sure there are some audience questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, lift your hand now before I proceed to the next question. One question, one might ask, of course, is India has attempted, we tried to put together a fact-checking coalition in place before the general election. We managed to do one for the state elections here in Rajasthan. But this was unstructured. This did not have an organization behind it. And perhaps had there been an organization, it would not have been a missed opportunity. Sachin, any last thoughts? Because we're running out of time. I'm going to ask everyone to do a 1-minute sort of summation on whether this kind of editorial collaboration, not technological, not commercial, is possible, and would you support it?
It is possible, but like The Guardian did with the Wikileaks, it has to be a really big story to create that impact. India itself has multiple regions with multiple languages, and just as the European Union will have multiple countries with multiple languages, and only when you go to each of these countries for collaborations will you have an impact which is continent-wide. Similarly, in India, you'll need to have collaborations which are across multiple geographies and multiple languages to have that impact. But that story has to demand that kind of a collaboration, which will encourage editors and publishers to say, yes, let's do this together. One. Two is that the impact, not just the bigness of the largeness of the story, but the impact of that story has to be sustained over a period of, a series of investigative reports. And if collaborators lose steam in between, and that is the biggest fear with editors or publishers, that what if somebody comes under pressure and a person who is in Delhi will continue it, but a person in Bangalore or vice versa will not continue that. So that kind of fear also needs to be addressed, and which is where what Ritu said about the trust factor between various publications, that has to come in right from the beginning. If that is not established at the get-go, then the whole collaboration might collapse.
So I think there is a lot of potential for collaborating. If you think, why does a journalist get out of bed in the morning? Actually, it's not to earn money. It's certainly not to make money for the news organization. You get out of bed and you do your job because you want to have impact. You want things to change as a result of your story. So if I think of the UK, I'll use some. The UK is the 7th biggest economy in the world. That's a rich country. And yet, in every city in the country, there are children working as prostitutes. That should have stopped 100 years ago, but the levels of child poverty in the UK have increased enormously in the last 30 years. Okay, now, suppose you are editing a local newspaper in one city. You can send a reporter out, and they do a story. And the people in that city will be shocked and ashamed to discover 12-year-old boys and girls selling their bodies to businessmen in the evening. But imagine how much more impact you would get if all of those different local newspapers in all of those different cities agreed, each of us will put a reporter onto this story and we'll all publish on the same day, then the government in London has to start listening about child poverty. And you could do the same with aggression against women. Whoops, I've been cut off. You could do the same with any subject that seems to you to be important, that deserves to have impact. One voice on its own will not necessarily be heard. But if all the voices in the UK, all the voices in India on the same day say the same thing, then you get impact, which is what we want.
Ritu and Rasmus?
I mean, I think there's huge potential for 3 different kinds of collaboration in journalism, both here as in everywhere else in the world. Profitable, practical, and principled. Profitable is about how we make the business of news work better, so that there actually are jobs for professional journalists to go out, seek truth and report, and hold power to account. Practical is the sharing of that information. This is what news agencies, non-profit news agencies have historically done, and I think there's an interesting question of, what is the next evolutionary stage of organizations like the Press Trust of India or the Associated Press? And finally, there's principled ones. As Ritu said, collaboration might be most possible when things are less politicized, but as Nick just suggested, with many issues, you may find a community of interest of people who share certain values and want to pursue a similar agenda and advance that. But of course, there has to be clarity about what is the principle behind this collaboration when people want to work together.
I think just going to step away a little bit from on this to say that given what we are dealing with right now in terms of press freedom, I think one of the collaborations that we can, if we can successfully pull off, is collaborate in having conversations with the government on regulatory policies that are going to come and stymie a lot of good journalism, because unless that is not fought, or at least conversations are not started, then a lot of good work on collaborations. I mean, we are so far away from what ICIJ has been able to pull off. Because like Rasmus was, we were talking earlier, and he was talking about the kind of tech that was needed to pull that off, for instance, which means you need to collaborate, not just on content, you have to collaborate in many, many ways. But before that, we need an environment right now where, there's talk about certification for digital content, there's talk about foreign investment, there is talk about, there's so much that we need to collaborate and be seen as one media to have a conversation with. So I think first we have to collaborate at high level.
Yeah, I mean, imagine the possibilities, as Nick, you were saying, if all newspapers, digital outlets, television channels, at least 1 or 2 per language, were to simultaneously publish an investigation, it would ask the government very, very tough questions. And on that note, we'll wrap up. Thanks to our panelists. A big round of applause to all of them.
Thank you, panelists, for the great session. I would like to invite Ayaz sir for the thanks note, please.
At the British Institute in